They thought it was just a family photo, until historians discovered who took the picture. Dr. Rebecca Torres stood in the climate-controlled archive room of the Charleston Historical Society, her gloved hands carefully lifting a daguerreotype from its protective case. The photograph showed a wealthy family posed on the grand veranda of a plantation house, a stern patriarch, his wife in an elaborate silk gown, and 3 children arranged like porcelain dolls. The image dated to 1858, just 3 years before the Civil War would tear the nation apart. "Beautiful composition," muttered James, her research assistant, leaning closer. "Look at the light quality. Whoever took this knew exactly what they were doing." Rebecca nodded, but something caught her eye. In the bottom right corner, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it, were 3 initials scratched into the metal plate: IMW. She had seen hundreds of daguerreotypes from this period, but rarely did photographers sign their work so subtly, almost as if hiding their identity. "Pull up the plantation records," she instructed. "I want to know everything about this family, the Hawthorns of Oakmont Plantation." As James typed away at his laptop, Rebecca couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. The photograph was technically perfect. The exposure, the framing, the deliberate arrangement of light and shadow. This wasn't the work of an amateur, or even a typical traveling photographer of the era. This was art. 3 hours later, James looked up from his screen, his face pale. "Rebecca, you need to see this." The plantation inventory from 1858 listed the family's possessions with meticulous detail: furniture, livestock, crops, and at the bottom of a long column, slaves. Among the names was one that made Rebecca's breath catch: Isaac, male, age 28, skilled tradesman, photography. "A slave took this photograph," James whispered. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she held the daguerreotype up to the light again. The initials suddenly took on new meaning. IMW. Isaac M. Washington, perhaps. The family in the photograph stared back at her, frozen in their wealth and privilege, completely unaware that the man documenting their legacy was a person they considered property. "We need to find out everything about him," Rebecca said quietly. "Everything." The weight of the discovery settled over them both. This wasn't just another historical photograph cataloged and filed away. This was a window into a life deliberately erased, a talent forcibly stolen, and perhaps, if they looked carefully enough, a voice that had been silenced but not completely extinguished. Rebecca placed the daguerreotype back in its case with reverence, already planning the next steps of their investigation. The following morning, Rebecca arrived at the archive before dawn, unable to sleep after the previous day's discovery. She spread dozens of documents across the long oak table: bills of sale, plantation ledgers, newspaper clippings from antebellum Charleston. Somewhere in these fragments of history, Isaac existed as more than just a name on an inventory list. James arrived an hour later carrying 2 cups of coffee and a stack of books from the library. "I found something," he said, his voice tight with excitement. There was a free black photographer in Charleston during the 1850s, a man named Marcus Washington. He had a small studio on Meeting Street. Rebecca's heart quickened. Washington, the same surname. Exactly. I'm wondering if there's a connection. Maybe Isaac was trained by him, or they were related before Isaac was enslaved. They dove into city directories, cross-referencing every mention of photographers, freedmen, and the Washington surname. By noon, they had constructed a partial timeline. Marcus Washington had operated his photography studio from 1852 to 1859, advertising his services to Charleston's elite. But there was something peculiar. In 1856, Marcus had purchased someone from the Hawthorns. "He bought Isaac's freedom?" James asked, confused. "Then why was Isaac still listed as enslaved in 1858? Rebecca studied the documents more carefully. "Look at this. Marcus purchased Isaac, but 2 months later, there's a record of Isaac being returned to the plantation. Something went wrong." The story was becoming clearer and more heartbreaking. Isaac had likely learned photography from Marcus, perhaps even worked alongside him. For a brief moment, he had tasted freedom, but somehow he had been forced back into bondage, his skills then exploited by the very family that enslaved him. "We need to find out what happened during those 2 months," Rebecca said, her voice firm despite the emotion welling up inside her. "And we need to find more of Isaac's photographs." James pulled out his phone. "I'll contact other archives and museums. If Isaac was this skilled, there might be more of his work scattered across collections, misattributed or unknown." Rebecca returned to the daguerreotype of the Hawthorne family, examining every inch of it under magnification. The family's faces revealed nothing. They posed with the practiced superiority of their class. But now, knowing who held the camera, the photograph felt different. It was no longer just a historical artifact. It was evidence of profound injustice, and perhaps a hidden act of resistance. Rebecca stood before the narrow building on Meeting Street, now a boutique selling overpriced candles and decorative pillows. But in 1852, this had been Marcus Washington's photography studio, one of the few black-owned businesses in a city built on slavery and cotton wealth. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones, and Rebecca tried to imagine what this street had looked like more than a century and a half ago. The current owner, a woman named Patricia, was surprisingly helpful when Rebecca explained her research. "There's a basement," Patricia said, leading them down a cramped staircase. "Previous owners just used it for storage, but there might be something from the original building. Nobody's really gone through everything down there." The basement smelled of mildew and old wood. Boxes of forgotten inventory lined the walls, dust thick on every surface. Rebecca's hopes began to fade as they moved deeper into the space. But then, in the far corner behind a stack of paint cans, she spotted something that made her pulse race. A wooden crate with M. Washington Photographic Chemicals stenciled on the side in faded black letters. Inside, wrapped in deteriorating cloth, were glass plate negatives, bottles of crystallized silver nitrate solution, and most remarkably, a leather-bound journal with water-stained pages. "Oh my God," James breathed, carefully opening the journal with gloved hands. The first page read in elegant handwriting, "Property of Marcus Washington, freedman and photographer, Charleston, South Carolina, 1852. Rebecca photographed each page with painstaking care, her hands steady despite her racing heart. Marcus had documented everything: his clients, his techniques, his struggles to maintain dignity and business in a society determined to keep him beneath its heel. And then, on a page dated April 1854, they found what they were looking for. "Today I met my brother Isaac for the first time in 18 years. He was brought to my studio by his enslaver, Richard Hawthorne, who wanted a portrait made. Isaac watched me work with such intensity I could see the hunger in his eyes, not for freedom alone, but for purpose, for craft, for something beautiful in this ugly world. When Hawthorne left him alone for a moment, Isaac spoke to me. 'Teach me,' he said." Just those two words. I wept after they left. The journal entries from April and May 1856 painted a picture of brief, joyful freedom. Marcus described teaching Isaac advanced photographic techniques, the two brothers working late into the night mixing chemicals and perfecting their craft. Isaac, Marcus wrote, had an extraordinary eye for composition, a natural understanding of light and shadow that rivaled any photographer Marcus had encountered, white or black. "Listen to this," Rebecca said, reading aloud. "Isaac sees things I miss. Yesterday we photographed a merchant's family, and Isaac suggested we position them near the window at an angle I would never have considered. The result was magnificent. The light fell across their faces like a painting by the old masters. My brother is not just learning this craft, he is transforming it." But then, in June 1856, the entries shifted dramatically in tone and handwriting. "They came for him today," Marcus wrote, his usually careful script shaky and irregular. "Hawthorne claimed I forged the bill of sale that Isaac was never legally mine to purchase. He brought the sheriff, 3 armed men, and a lawyer who declared the transaction void. Isaac begged them. He stood in my studio and begged to remain free, and they laughed at him. Hawthorne said Isaac was too valuable a property to lose, that his skills with the camera would serve the plantation's interests better than any freedom ever could. They dragged my brother away in chains while I stood helpless, my papers meaning nothing against the word of a white man. What is justice in a land where the law itself is designed to perpetuate our bondage?" Rebecca had to pause her reading, overcome by the cruelty of it. James sat silently across from her, his jaw clenched, anger and sorrow evident in his eyes. The next entry was dated a week later. I have consulted every lawyer willing to see a black man. They all say the same. Even if my documents were legitimate, which they dispute, a slaveholder's rights supersede any claim I might make. The law was not written to protect men like me or my brother. I am told to accept this, to be grateful for my own freedom and forget Isaac. How does one forget his own blood? How do I look at my camera each day and not see his hands, his eyes, his brilliant mind trapped in that place? Marcus made several attempts to see Isaac at Oakmont Plantation over the following months, but was turned away each time by armed overseers. His letters went unanswered, or were likely destroyed before Isaac ever saw them. His petitions to local authorities were ignored or dismissed with barely concealed contempt. By August 1856, his journal entries became sporadic and filled with despair. I am dying inside, Marcus wrote in September. Each day I wake hoping to hear news of my brother, and each day brings only silence. I continue my work because I must survive, but the joy has gone from it. Every portrait I take reminds me of the one person I cannot photograph, Isaac, standing beside me as a free man. Then, in October 1856, something changed. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she read the entry aloud to James. I received a letter today, smuggled out by someone whose name I dare not write even in these private pages. Isaac wants me to know he is alive and that he is still photographing. Hawthorne forces him to document the plantation, the crops, the family, everything they wish to preserve of their empire built on our suffering. But Isaac writes that he has found a way to resist, to leave something behind that they cannot see or control. He asks me to trust him, to wait, to look carefully at his work when the time comes. He says, "Brother, I am writing with light what I cannot speak with words. Those who know how to see will find my truth hidden in their lies." Rebecca looked at James, excitement cutting through the grief they'd been feeling. He was leaving messages in his photographs. But what kind of messages? James asked. And how do we find them after all this time? Rebecca turned back to the journal, reading the final entries Marcus had written about Isaac. In November 1856, Marcus wrote, I have begun to understand what Isaac means. I acquired a photograph taken at a neighboring plantation, not by Isaac, but it helped me see what he might be doing. A photograph captures everything in its frame, not just what the subject wishes to show. Isaac has the eyes to see what others miss, and the skill to ensure it remains visible for those who look. The journal continued with Marcus's daily business until 1859, but there were no more mentions of Isaac. The final entry was brief and haunting. My studio closes today. I can no longer remain in this city where my brother suffers in bondage while I walk free. Rebecca contacted every museum, historical society, and private collector she could find who might possess daguerreotypes from South Carolina plantations in the late 1850s. Her inquiry was specific. She was looking for photographs that might have been taken at Oakmont Plantation, or any images bearing the subtle signature IMW. She spent hours crafting emails, making phone calls, explaining the significance of what she was searching for. Within a week, responses began arriving. The Smithsonian had 2 photographs from Oakmont, one of the plantation house itself, and another of enslaved workers in the cotton fields. A private collector in Virginia possessed a portrait of Richard Hawthorne standing beside his prized racehorse. The Charleston Museum had 3 more images from various plantations, all bearing Isaac's hidden initials when examined closely. Each institution agreed to send high-resolution digital scans. Rebecca and James spent days examining every detail of these photographs, looking for whatever resistance Isaac had embedded in his work. They set up multiple monitors in the archive, displaying each image at maximum resolution, zooming into every corner and shadow. Look at this one, James said, pointing to the photograph of enslaved workers in the cotton field. The composition seems off, doesn't it? Like he deliberately avoided centering them the way a traditional photographer would. Rebecca zoomed in, her eyes scanning every inch of the image. James was right. The workers were positioned to the far left of the frame, their faces turned away from the camera, their bodies angled toward the right edge of the image, as if the photograph had been improperly framed. But in doing so, Isaac had captured something else entirely. A brutal overseer standing in the background, whip in hand, his face caught in an expression of cold cruelty that no enslaver would have wanted documented. "He was documenting the violence," Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not just the romanticized version slaveholders wanted preserved for posterity, but the truth of what slavery actually was. He's showing us what they tried to hide." James pulled up another image, the portrait of Richard Hawthorne with his horse. "And here, look at Hawthorne's expression. Most portrait photographers of that era would have had him adjust his face, smile slightly, appear dignified. But Isaac captured him looking arrogant, almost cruel. It's subtle, but once you see it, you can't unsee it." The photograph of Oakmont Plantation's main house was perhaps the most revealing of all. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard architectural documentation. The grand white columns, the wraparound porch, the manicured garden stretching out in perfect symmetry. It was the kind of image meant to showcase Southern wealth and refinement, the visual propaganda of the planter class. But Rebecca noticed something unusual about the framing. Isaac had positioned his camera at a slight angle, not straight on, as was typical for architectural photography of the period. This subtle shift in perspective did something extraordinary. It captured, in the far left background, the slave quarters. Small, cramped wooden structures that stood in stark contrast to the main house's grandeur. "He's juxtaposing their wealth with the source of it," James said, his voice filled with admiration. "He's making it impossible to see one without seeing the other." Rebecca zoomed in on the slave quarters. Even at this distance, even in a photograph over a century and a half old, she could make out figures standing in the doorways. Men, women, children. Isaac had ensured they were visible, that they existed in this frame not as invisible labor, but as human beings whose presence challenged the entire narrative the photograph was supposed to tell. But there was something else. Rebecca adjusted the contrast and brightness of the digital image, a technique impossible in Isaac's time, but one that revealed what he had known would be there. On the porch of the main house, barely visible in the shadows of the columns, stood a figure. As Rebecca enhanced the image further, the figure became clearer, a black man holding what appeared to be photographic equipment. "Is that—" James started. "It's him," Rebecca breathed. Isaac photographed himself. He found a way to include his own reflection or shadow in the image. He's saying, "I was here. I made this. I see you." They sat in stunned silence, staring at the figure on the porch. It was a self-portrait unlike any other from that era. Not posed, not formal, but hidden in plain sight. A ghost in the machine of slavery's documentation of itself. Rebecca's phone buzzed. Another museum had responded to her inquiry. The Library of Congress had just discovered an entire collection of daguerreotypes from Oakmont Plantation in their uncatalogued archives, at least 15 images, all bearing Isaac's signature mark. With the arrival of the additional photographs from the Library of Congress, Rebecca and James had assembled the most complete collection of Isaac's work ever gathered in one place. 15 images from Oakmont Plantation, spanning from 1856 to 1859, each one a masterpiece of technical skill, and each one hiding layers of meaning beneath its surface. But Rebecca kept returning to the first photograph that had started everything, the Hawthorne family portrait on the veranda. Now, with everything they had learned about Isaac's techniques, his subtle acts of resistance, his genius for embedding truth within the lies he was forced to photograph, she looked at this image with entirely new eyes. "There's something we're missing," she told James one evening as they worked late in the archive. This was the photograph that led us to Isaac. His initials are here, more visible than in any of his other work. He wanted this one to be found. He wanted someone someday to look closely at this specific image. James pulled his chair closer to the monitor. "What are we not seeing?" Rebecca began systematically examining every inch of the photograph. The family's clothing, their postures, the furniture they sat upon, the architectural details of the house behind them. Everything appeared exactly as it should in a formal plantation portrait of the era. Then her eyes fell on something she had dismissed as a shadow near the right edge of the frame. She zoomed in, adjusted the levels, and felt her heart begin to pound. It wasn't a shadow. It was a figure, deliberately positioned just at the boundary of the photographic plate, partially cut off by the frame's edge but unmistakably present. A young black girl, perhaps 10 years old, standing motionless and staring directly at the camera. "Who is she?" James whispered. Rebecca pulled up the Oakmont plantation inventory records they had collected. She scanned through the list of enslaved people, looking for children of the right age in 1858. There, a girl named Sarah, age 10, listed as house servant. But it was the notation next to her name that made Rebecca's hands freeze. Daughter of Isaac, photographer. Isaac had a child, and he had found a way to include her in the photograph, to ensure that she existed in this record not as property listed in an inventory but as a human being, his daughter, visible in the frame alongside the family that enslaved them both. The discovery of Sarah transformed everything Rebecca and James thought they understood about Isaac's work. This wasn't just resistance or documentation, it was deeply personal. Rebecca immediately began searching for any records of Sarah, any trace of what had happened to her. The plantation records were sparse but telling. Sarah had been born in 1848, which meant Isaac had fathered her when he was just 18 years old. There was no mention of Sarah's mother in the official documents, a common omission that rendered enslaved women invisible even in records of their own children. "Look at this," James said, pointing to a bill of sale from 1859. Sarah was sold. Hawthorne sold her to a family in Georgia just a year after this photograph was taken. Rebecca felt sick. Isaac had managed to include his daughter in the family portrait, had ensured her image would survive, but he couldn't protect her from being torn away and sold. The cruelty of it was overwhelming. But then James found something else, a letter tucked into a collection of correspondence between Marcus and a freedman in Atlanta. The letter was dated 1863, and it was from Isaac. "Brother," the letter began, "I write this in secret, trusting that God will deliver these words to you. The war has brought chaos to Oakmont. Hawthorne fled when Union troops approached, and many of us have claimed our freedom simply by walking away from this place. I am searching for Sarah. I was told she was sold to a family in Savannah, not Georgia as Hawthorne's records showed. I will not rest until I find her. The photographs I made, they were not just for myself or for history. They were for her, so that one day she might see her father's work and know that I existed as more than what they tried to make me." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. He went looking for her. "And there's more," James said, pulling up another document. Marcus hired investigators in 1863 to help find Sarah. There are receipts, letters, reports from men who traveled through Georgia and South Carolina asking about a girl matching her description. They spent the next 2 days following the paper trail. The story that emerged was incomplete but hopeful. Sarah had indeed been in Savannah, where she had been working as a house servant for a merchant family. When Union forces occupied the city in 1864, she had escaped and made her way to a contraband camp, a settlement of formerly enslaved people under Union protection. The final pieces of the story came together through a combination of military records, Freedmen's Bureau documents, and census data. In 1865, after the war ended, Isaac and Sarah were reunited in Charleston. Marcus had found them both and brought them back to the city where he had reopened his photography studio. Rebecca discovered a newspaper advertisement from 1866, Washington Brothers Photography, portraits of the highest quality, Isaac and Marcus Washington, freedmen and artists. Below it, in smaller print, training available for colored youth in the photographic arts. They worked together, James said, smiling through his own tears. After everything, they finally got to work together as free men. But the most extraordinary discovery came from the Smithsonian's newly digitized collection. A photograph from 1867 showed 3 people standing in front of a photography studio. Marcus, Isaac, and a young woman who could only be Sarah, now 16 years old. All 3 looked directly at the camera with expressions of quiet dignity and strength. The caption, written in Isaac's handwriting, read, Washington family, photographers, Charleston, South Carolina. Rebecca arranged for all of Isaac's known photographs to be properly attributed and exhibited together for the first time. The exhibition, which opened at the Charleston Museum 6 months after her initial discovery, was titled Through His Eyes, Isaac Washington and the Art of Resistance. On opening night, Rebecca stood before the Hawthorne family portrait, the photograph that had started everything, but now it was displayed with full context, the story of who took it, why he embedded his daughter in the frame, what he risked to document the truth of slavery's violence and humanity's persistence. An elderly man approached her, his eyes fixed on the photograph. "My name is David," he said quietly. "My great-great-grandmother was Sarah Washington. She became a photographer too, you know, learned from her father and her uncle. I have some of her work at home, photographs of freed families, of people building new lives after slavery. Nobody knew her father was the one who took these plantation photographs. Nobody knew our family's history until now." Rebecca felt the weight of the past and present converge. Isaac's act of resistance, hiding his daughter in a photograph, documenting truth within lies, leaving his signature for someone to find, had worked. More than a century and a half later, his voice was finally being heard, his genius finally recognized, his family's story finally told.